Thank you. Thank you very much, Susie. You know, how many of you have ever experienced barriers in your life? You just really wanted to get something accomplished, but it seemed like that everything that could go wrong did go wrong. There was something there that have you ever heard this? I just couldn't get over the hump. I just couldn't get past this. I just couldn't penetrate and get where I needed to go. Joshua understood that very clearly. The children of Israel had been in the wilderness wandering for many, many years. The first barrier they came upon was the River Jordan. God opened that river for them, just as they had walked through many years ago. Just Joshua and Caleb had been those two who had walked through the Red Sea 40 years earlier, and now God put some stones with the priest in the middle of the river, and they were able to walk through on dry ground. Soon they came up unto this fortified city named Jericho. The Bible tells us in Hebrews, the 11th chapter, verse 30, whenever this great theater of faith chapter is there, this is how that the account in the New Testament, the historical account, was given. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell down after being encircled for 7 days. Wow. A barrier was broken. Walls are unique things. They were built around the city of Jericho as a defensive measure. It was in the low country, down simply below the hills of Judea, down next to the river Jordan, prior to the area where you would move down towards the Dead Sea. They were in that valley area. They were an area where people were able to pass through very easily. They had fresh water there, which was very vital in that part of the country and at that time. The walls were built by the people of Jericho to defend themselves, to keep people on the outside. The problem was that God had given this land to the children of Israel. And God didn't want to keep them on the outside. God wanted His presence on the inside of those walls. So there was an option. How was He going to get there? The enemy was on the inside. God's children, who were challenged to be a blessing to all men they came in contact with, were on the outside of those walls. It is interesting, when this particular took place, there was a challenge. God said, I've got a plan for you. I've got a plan of how to get through those walls. I want to inside. But you realize that is still true today? Satan has barriers all around this area. He has homes engulfed with his power. He has thrown up walls and barriers of excuses and walls and barriers of dislike, walls and barriers of distrust to try to keep God out of their homes. We have political means of doing that. We have all kinds of laws. We have all of those things. Just as in that day, the task almost seems impossible when we think about sharing the gospel with everyone in our community, everyone in our area, every one of our neighbors. You see, like the plan God used to break down the walls of Jericho, He's given us a plan. He's given us a means to challenge those barriers. It may seem difficult, just like the children of Israel's plan would seem difficult. But yet I believe, folks, that Satan's barriers in this community can be broken down, and we can get the gospel message inside those homes. And I want you to look at some of the things that's going to be required for that to happen. I think there are 3 simple things that I want to talk with you about this morning out of this particular passage. The first of those is faith. Faith is absolutely going to be required if we're going to succeed in breaking down the barriers and reaching people in this community. God has broken down some barriers already, and it is not impossible to break down other barriers. And the first step of breaking down those barriers must be faith. Martin Luther wrote it this way many years ago. Faith sees the invisible, believes the incredible, and receives the impossible. Did you catch that? By faith, It is possible. Matter of fact, if you go back to that 11th chapter of the book of Hebrews, the Bible tells us through Paul's writings that without faith it's impossible to please God. You can't do it. You can't accomplish God's work without faith. You can't become a Christian without faith, folks. You cannot walk with God without trusting Him, believing Him. And after all, when you trust Him and believing Him that He can do exactly what He said He could do, what do you call that? Faith. Faith. It is the substance of things hoped for. It is the evidence of things not seen. But the Bible tells us in the book of Hebrews, it is through that faith that our forefathers, depending upon God, received a good report. And He tells us about many of those who have done the things of faith. The first step, the very first step, God used to break down the walls of Jericho was faith. Do you realize that? Well, you say, well, wait just a minute. Why? He said to march around the city. Folks, but there's an area of faith there. One writer put it this way, because obstacles stand in all of our way. He said, I don't mind obstacles unless they get in the way. But they do get in the way, don't they? And a lack of faith, a lack of commitment, and a lack of effort are those things. But faith is paramount in all of those things. There was a simple problem about Jericho. That's so obvious that sometimes we just look over it. Those that God wanted to influence by the children of Israel being in the promised land were inside the walls. God's people in representation of God, the Ark of the Covenant, was on the outside of the walls. And what stood between them was a wall complex. You say that was a physical wall. Yeah, I know it was. And there's physical walls and barriers all over our community. There's also spiritual walls and barriers in our community that will keep us from penetrate those. Have you ever thought about what Jericho might have looked like? I was privileged a couple of times to walk down around the ancient city of Jericho, where it was at, and to see some evidence of where those walls had fallen down. It was a military fortress. It wasn't a single wall. It was a complex of walls that defended the city of Jericho. The outer wall was some 6 feet thick. It was made of stone. It was some 30 feet tall. Now you think, well, that was pretty big, wasn't it? 6 feet thick, 30 foot tall. That's pretty big. But 15 feet inside of that wall was a second wall. Now that second wall was even more formidable than the first wall that was out there. This wall was twice as thick. It was 12 feet thick, and it was also 30 feet high, with 15 feet between the two. On top of those walls, they had taken and built houses and built fortress houses across the top. They were able to come out here, and then they would retreat back to the back wall. If somehow they penetrated the first wall, they could get them at the second wall. The walls weren't straight up, and when we think about it, matter of fact, the walls were tapered this way, larger at the bottom and smaller at the top. The reason is that you oftentimes could push over a straight wall somehow, but when it's that wide at the bottom, the problem is you can't push it over. Secondly, if you try to climb up that wall, it's at an angle, and they had rocks up on top of that wall, and they would roll those rocks down. They would roll logs down and hit the people. They would be able to pour boiling oil, hot water down. And if you tried to go up those walls, you wouldn't be able to accomplish it. You see, they were almost, from a militaristic point of view of that day, totally unconquerable. The difficulty was, folks, is that nothing is impossible with God. The reality is there. Joshua looked at those walls. A man who had walked through the bodies of water twice on dry ground. He looked at all of the folks that had walked over that river with him, through that river with him. He looked at his military commanders. He looked at the massive group of people. He looked at the priest. He looked at the ark. And the interesting thing that the book of Joshua tells us is that he did not consult a single one of them on how to conquer those walls. You know what he did? He asked God.